requirements were one of the issues we discussed a lot, just how to make these shelters practical. And we don't have a good solution to that. The issues that came up were issues that had been discussed before here and also were discussed last December. The unauthorized use of retrobaits, snakes, just different issues, what makes a shelter a difficult thing for a small community to put in. It was mentioned that in fact 60% was the statistic that came up of manufactured homes are not in these communities. So 60% are not in these communities. What does a community shelter mean? Your maximum penetration is 40%. So some similar limitations. We felt this was a long-term issue. It wasn't going to get solved immediately. Funding is the big issue here for these, and just where would that funding come from, particularly in these smaller communities and not well-to-do communities. Again, if you force the owners to do it, they might just shut down if they're borderline right now. And then some of the challenges were engineering challenges when we discussed just trying to make safe things. Could you make something snake or reprobate proof? And probably, there probably are ways you could do that if we just thought of better, I don't know, combination locks, but then people have to remember them. There are things that are discussed and dismissed, but maybe there's some better ways you could make multi-purpose safe and perhaps cheap shelters. There certainly have been challenges before to try to make a cheap computer, and I don't know, somebody's giving away computers to the third world, because they came up with a cheap computer or a cheap water distiller. So perhaps a cheap shelter would be an interesting challenge for, I don't know, some kind of SBIR or something. Third, disaster recovery and reconstruction. We talked about how different communities were responding to disasters, and Tuscaloosa and Joplin came up as contrasts in terms of, and Joplin was really encouraging quick reconstruction, and I think was relaxing building codes and just saying, build up quick, we want to be back. Whereas Tuscaloosa, and I don't know if these are 100% accurate descriptions, but I'm relaying the discussion. Tuscaloosa, on the other hand, was taking a more considered response, which was kind of a longer response to recovery. But having more pre-disaster discussions about what you're going to do post-disaster. For example, in New Orleans, it was difficult to find places to put the displaced people. Well, maybe having a pre-plan and pre-authorization where the mayor or something in an emergency can take over the park without having to get authorization or all that. But pre-legalization of certain disaster plans. To take care of the immediate recovery, and then possibly the long term. Just what would we do if our town was destroyed by, or parts of our town were destroyed by a tornado? What would we do in terms of infrastructure? Do we want to redesign, or do we just want to rebuild? The major issues here are politics, just making it happen, but it could be pretty short term. Another challenge is just keeping these plans current, because communities change every few years. But it probably could be done pretty easily, pretty cheaply, this kind of plan to what would you do if a tornado hit your community. D was discussed elsewhere. This is probably my pet rock, so we deviated from trying to come up with things that are different. But I think we were pretty unanimous that we really need to understand this problem better. Basically, why are people dying? Why are people injured? Why are people surviving? Which I guess is non-death/injury. So that we can basically become informed better about whether we need better forecasts, better lead times, less false alarms. Do we need better public response? Do we need better communication? We don't really know what we need. We're coming up with all these solutions, but we don't know why the people died in the first place. I call that. And so what we were encouraging was that we have a systematic procedure where we do detailed surveys and studies, interdisciplinary studies, independent studies, of the damage and also of where people were die, where people were hurt, how they got the message or didn't get the message. We called it CSI Tornado. We basically need to get people in there in a systematic way. It seems kind of ad hoc right now. These are things that could happen short term. We should have written funding. Oh, there it is. Funding is an issue. Interagency communication is an issue. Oh, 2 minutes? Almost done. And 3, I did talk slow, see? Last was how to better communicate warnings. Again, we have to decide how well they're communicated right now. But we identified, again, different kinds of groups, which we've discussed before, which may have different needs for warnings, may have different needs for education. Do renters know what they're supposed to do when a tornado comes? Do they know where their shelters are? You know, do they know that they're in a tornado risk area if they've come from someplace out of that area? And that is something which would need some funding to be researched, but could be short-term evaluation and implication, we felt, at least seeing whether people are getting the word, and it might be cheap to get them the word better. I mean, for example, putting Spanish warnings, warning text, we assumed would be pretty cheap, and there are other things that might be cheap implementations there. And then, in my last 30 seconds, we actually filled in the matrix things. Look at that. Thank you very much. We tackled the matrix. Probably not very well, though. So, any complaints or questions?
Yeah, this is a simple question. What is the incremental cost in improving the building code so the building withstands a higher wind?
Incremental cost of changing the code, or actually the cost of doing it, of people obeying the code?
The incremental cost in construction to comply with the code.
Somebody has a better answer than me. I think sometimes a lot. Some of these buildings are built pretty poorly.
The incremental cost, at least for installing safe rooms or shelters, is what about on the order of 20% increase of the construction cost of the portion of the building that's being retrofitted, not the overall project or anything, of the portion of the building. So you got a school project, you're going to harden one wing to make that the shelter. Now that's for new construction. Retrofit's more expensive. In terms of just overall improving building codes and construction, again, that's sort of a whole continuum, and I think certainly one of the research needs, and Dave and I work in that area, is we need to sort of look at what's cost effective, get the economics folks with us, and sort of how much you can do for different levels. Dave, you have anything else you want to say?
Yeah, I mean, how tough you want to make these buildings is I don't know, that's a society moral kind of decision. I mean, you want to make it F5 proof or F2 proof? How would that apply to I mean, we're talking a lot about manufactured homes. I mean, you can't put a strong room in a...
When it comes to enhancing building codes, one of the things that has been advanced is the idea, the existing building code in most of the tornado-prone part of the United States has as a standard that the home would resist structural damage up to 90 miles an hour. In the coast areas that are vulnerable to hurricanes, the building codes have generally been enhanced to 125 mile per hour or higher standards. The sort of enhancements to construction required to bring your building up to that higher specification is probably mostly tied up with labor costs as opposed to materials. Materials are really relatively inexpensive, hurricane clips kinds of additions. Retrofitting them is more expensive than building new homes to that standard. And obviously it doesn't make the home tornado proof, but it does make it more resistant to tornado winds.
A more fundamental question, not just for Josh, back to the unidentified research needs. But actually, that's the wording isn't right. Many of the stuff that you talked about and others, they're not unidentified. They're already well known, and people are working those. So I guess my question is, where's the list of identified research needs? Do we have two lists going on here? I'm just wondering, we're adding on to the list, and now we've got this long list of identified needs, which is not here, and then these new unidentified needs. So I guess it's not just at you, Josh, but am I missing something here?
That's what the white papers were for.
I mean, I think most of what was in this presentation, and the other colored ones, oranges and greens and purples, were all. A lot of this was covered in the individual discipline groups too. I mean, I think there's a lot of overlap. But right, it's got to all get synthesized, right?
Yeah, but the point of the white papers was to identify needs, and we were hoping to get out of these breakout groups was to find out what did we miss in the white papers and what did we miss when we got to talking to each other. So that's, I think, a key thing.
But at some point, are we going to assimilate those and have one list?
Mike is. Yes, that'll be done. Yes.
To go back to the question on the how much does it cost? Obviously, I think it would vary from different part of the country, but right now in Tarrant County, back in Texas, where I'm from, we got a hazard mitigation grant from FEMA for safe room development, and roughly the average cost is somewhere between $5,000 to $7,000. The grant allows us to reimburse the applicant, the resident, up to 50% of the cost, up to $3,000, and working with the different safe room manufacturers and the associations. The cost has been somewhere between $5,000 to $7,000. Obviously, I think that would probably vary depending on what part of the country you're from.
I think the one more point I would add about the building codes is there is a need of real fundamental research to understand the differences between the hurricane animal and the tornado animal as it interacts with the structure. We're right now just assuming that we have the same type of phenomenon all throughout, and we will just need to increase it by a certain percentage by the wind speed, but it may not be that simple, and that is a place for real fundamental research that can happen and is probably ongoing right now.
Okay. We've heard from the groups. We'd like to open it up for, we've gotten some general discussion, but we'd like to open it up to other, any other questions or thoughts that people have been developing as you've been sitting here listening, perhaps some common themes that you're hearing, or things that maybe not be common, but that you look at it and go, I could put those things together into a nice package. We'd like to hear from anyone on that.
I got one quick comment, and I heard us use the terms throughout the last 2 days. And I just want to make sure that we're all on the same pages when we say shelters. I believe we're talking about pre-impact shelters, and sometimes I've heard us use the term shelters, and in the context that it's being used, I feel that maybe some of us may be using we're talking about after a tornado impacts and people are displaced and we have to shelter the residents. That's a different type of shelter. And I just want to make sure that we're differentiating between a safe room and a post-impact shelter facility.
Yeah, that's a real problem. When the tornado that hit Norman a week and a half ago, the school that my wife teaches at was used as a displaced persons shelter, but we had storms again the next night, and people were thinking that they were in a safe shelter, which was not remotely true.
That's bad.
Yeah, well,
I just
define bad.
Bad. This is actually just a point that goes with the Red Group's presentation, that Walter had 2 points that didn't make it onto our group slides, and his 2 points were that if we're trying to reduce mortality, that mobile homes and nighttime tornadoes are a big issue. And the nighttime tornado, mobile homes, of course, have been mentioned frequently, but nighttime tornadoes haven't come up. So there are issues with communicating at night that should be on somebody's research agenda.
I was in the yellow group, and so we did the start from the ground up and see how we would build a system. And it struck me that, especially for the point one, which we spent some time on, was taking some moments to identify all the potential users, their needs, their level of sophistication, the actions that will be needed, the decisions they will make. I would argue that a lot of the other bullets from the other presentations could actually start to fill out that piece. And so then we can identify sort of where the gaps are, who are we not taking care of as far as the information they need to make the decisions and the actions that are required. So I just wanted to throw that in. I think that's kind of a foundation where we can start from and then go from there.
Craig Trumbo up here.
It just kind of occurred to me that there's one dimension entirely that maybe is unaddressed at this point. And if we're talking about things like compliance and behavior, social normative factors are very important in shaping the way that people understand what they should do and the process by which they go out and execute these things. And there are a lot of very subtle things that affect social normative pressure. Out of curiosity, I just typed tornado into YouTube, and there's 25,000 examples of people getting a siren alert and not getting more information or going to shelter, but running outside. So, you know, there may be kind of a shift that's gone on recently in terms of how people orient toward this type of risk, and that might be worth looking at in terms of message creation and improving compliance.
Yeah, and as an anecdote for that, Joe's got his hand up back there. There's an example from Henryville, Indiana, of apparently of a couple deciding to film the tornado that they were aware of approaching their house and waiting too long to get to shelter, and the gentleman was killed. And, Joe?
I think another thing that might be useful for us to think about going forward is, the gentleman in the front mentioned this, is a better sense of how forecasting works now in terms of what products are, particularly in AWS, what products are available, what products are being developed, what things are being tested, so some sense of where, because I think some of these ideas have been discussed, and many of them have some type of iteration or version or attempt at that, and I think maybe those of us that are less connected to the operations side just aren't as aware of them. So that might be a good starting point to help integrate some of these more conceptual ideas from the research side with the more operational concerns. So just a better sense of kind of what does a typical day look like in a forecast office, and what are the products that typically get used, and what are the things that are being developed or being envisioned to see how these other ideas and concerns interface with things going forward.
Yeah, and I hate to speak on behalf of Bill Bunting as the new ops branch chief at SPC, but SPC has historically been relatively open to having people look at their products and their operations to see how they do, and in part because they aren't really sure how their products get used except by local forecast offices. You did a great job speaking. Yeah, I've been to enough of your meetings to know what's going on. Other questions and comments? We got one more up here in the front. Bill. Ooh, that was really exciting. I want you to know. I hope you all enjoyed that as much as I did.
I've been hearing some things, and I'm sort of struggling with how to deal with them. There's been a great deal of emphasis about the very diverse set of users that have interest in and are affected by weather information. And, I don't think we would necessarily have some design that would specifically exclude anyone from consideration. I would hope that we would, in fact, seek input and so forth from all these diverse people. But to some extent, I think it's almost impossible for the Weather Service or any warning agency to craft a product that can be all things to all people. And necessarily, I think any product the Weather Service produces is going to have some people that are going to get it and some people that aren't going to get it. And I don't know of any easy way to fix that. And so I'm not sure that we need to focus on making sure we consider every single special interest group in trying to design a new warning system. I think it's perhaps impractical for us to have something designed into the product that will serve every single person.
Elizabeth?
The antidote to that is, well, wait a minute. The antidote to that, I just wanted to follow up real quick, was, well, aren't those people who are not going to get it, aren't they the most vulnerable in the society anyway?
The ones that are dying.
Right. So should we design a warning system for those people?
Talking about improving the fatality performance and so forth of the system, I think we have to start from what Josh is saying and look at who are the ones who are becoming the victims. And identify them. They're our primary targets.
Okay. The next order. Elizabeth, Betsy, Wang.
My voice changed there a minute ago. Let me preface this by saying don't shoot the messenger, okay? I just want to inject something into the conversation here, which is, I think, to the point about can't be everything to everybody. I understand that point. I agree with it. But I would ask you to be careful in one specific area and to engage the National Weather Service's General Counsel in this part of the conversation, because the reality is, at least through the field of emergency management, we are seeing an upshoot right now in litigation being brought against jurisdictions under Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that is because the ADA has established a protected class. And so if you meet the federal definition of disability, as many of these subgroups will, then the requirement for any government service being provided must be held to a standard where the accommodation or the change in the program or the project meets the needs of that protected class. So while I would like to say that that is our goal, to meet every need for everybody because that's just the right thing to do as a society, there is still within all of those groups a protected class under the law, and we need to take that into account because we are entering into a time period now, albeit 20 years plus since the signing of the ADA in 1990, where a particular group of persons have started to find a means and way to assert that right. And so whether it's the Department of Justice actually bringing through Project Civic Access or other compliance factors on behalf of the class of persons, or if it's individuals through their own private class action itself, this is something that needs to be taken into account. I'm sure the economists will say that that is a factor that can be weighed and studied, but it's still a legal issue for General Counsel's consideration and advice. Again, don't shoot the messenger, just putting out a reality check.
Yeah. Okay. And Betsy?
And I'd like to remind everyone that not everything needs to be done by the National Weather Service, that we've got a tremendous weather enterprise out there that includes private industry that are thrilled to be jumping on new opportunities to serve very specific categories of people. I'm not sure if I've got this figure right, but I think we're now at a place in this country where there's more than one cell phone for each person on average, which means that I don't think we've tapped yet the full capability of tailoring information to different groups, to different individuals as they want to receive it. I don't think we can sort of see the end of the full picture yet, but I think we're on a track right now, undeniably, no matter what the National Weather Service does, where we're going to have a lot of tailored products for individuals. So let's keep an open mind, and I'm hoping that one of the next stages will be to engage the private sector, see what they want to do. I think what still remains on the government's shoulders is to take a look at which are the underserved populations and make sure that they don't fall through the cracks.
I would say that if you don't want to have a seat for the Department of Justice on the table here, then I would urge that we don't use this language of not of just simply saying that, oh, we can't get to them, so they're not important. Legally, I can't use that language. If I were to imply that, I would have the Department of Justice investigating the city of Fort Worth, and not just us, but the whole entire city for failure for noncompliance with the ADA. And they're a segment of my population, so they are taxpayers. They're somebody's brothers and sisters, somebody's father, somebody's mother, and may not be economically feasible cost-benefit analysis, but I cannot politically or morally be in a position to where I'm going to say that I'm not going to do whatever I can to get the message to that segment of our population.
Okay, I'm going to take the chair's prerogative just for a moment. In that, I mean, to me, one of the conundrums that we face in that is one way we can serve everyone is to provide a very, very base product and to not do much beyond tornado warning for whatever county. And then the challenge to me becomes, if there are ways that we could communicate additional information to some people, are we going to say we don't communicate that information because to do so would be unfair to those who cannot receive that information in other ways? I had an example with some of my Canadian colleagues who had wrote a really wonderful internal memo on a tornado event that occurred, and I saw it, and then they realized that meant that I had seen it, and to go out officially from the government of Canada, it had to be bilingual, and they hadn't gotten translated into French. So they turned it off to everyone, so that no one got the information because they couldn't get it served equally to all people. And that's a real, that to me is a real tough nut to crack. We have this, we're essentially talking about some of the equivalent possibilities, and oh boy, that's a hard one for me. I don't know what to do with that.
And I'm not saying turn it off. I'm saying working with other methods of dissemination, whether they are privately centered or whether there is a local broadcast media or whether it's local government in a coordinated, integrated warning system. That's what we need to be as a nation, be working, striving to do.
I'm just adding on to that. I think actually one of the ways that we've seen by application here, I'm applying something a little different, is that the National Weather Service, while it can't do certain actions or activities, it can offer its thoughts and guidance and recommendation to those who then are in the role and have the responsibility or the capability. So don't forget that you can still put forward, we recognize the following and would hope to work with or would like to see and would support, that kind of thing. Okay. So that is a way that you can go that step further without actually having to take it on as your obligation.
Okay. Robert?
Two comments. We seem to be talking about the communication of information to the public as a one-way street, and I think there's lots of technology that we could leverage. So if it needs to be tailored, let the communication be a two-way street. That's an idea. Obviously, it's a hornet's nest of problems, but we're just thinking about it as a one-way street. I think that might be handicapping. I'll just stop with that.
Other comments? Okay, seeing none, Mike is going to come up and provide us with some guidance for the next step and explain the secret matrix that we didn't even put onto the next one.
It's a hypercube.
Could you bring up the...
Okay, so the next group is back to your disciplinary groups. You can discuss the information that has been generated to this point. So it's the white papers, the discussion group 1 for the disciplinary groups, the discussions from the interdisciplinary groups, not only what you learned from your own groups, but also what you picked up from the plenary presentations. What we would like you to do is to identify and briefly describe 3 research projects. Forget the at least part, 3, okay? Because what was 6 groups, that'll generate 18 research projects. And that's more than NOAA and NSF, well, more than some of the sponsors want to see. And what we'd like to have you do is, after you've described them, to assess those 3 projects, each of those projects with respect to the criteria that were mentioned before. And one of the ideas from the interdisciplinary groups is that we would come up with a set of modified criteria. We were kind of all over the map, and I'm not going to try to impose any other structure than to say that you ought to use the criteria that were talked about initially in the slides. So that is, what's the cost going to be? How much money would it take to do this particular project? And when we're talking about project, it's not necessarily the scope of a standard NSF proposal. It can be broader than that, but we don't want you to propose a 30-year, $100 million program. So these are things that need to be useful to the sponsoring agencies. So how much money it's going to cost, whether it's going to require interdisciplinary collaboration, and if so, what kinds of disciplines would be best involved in this, and be realistic about it. That you don't have to go into a detailed proposal, but it has to be realistic in the sense that if you're going to involve people from a number of different disciplines, what is a plausible mechanism by which you're going to involve them? Are you going to have a core from 1 or 2 disciplines and then an advisory panel from other disciplines, or are you going to have multiple disciplines all equally involved, in which case, when you're thinking about how much it's going to cost, that you're not asking somebody to subsidize the research by doing thousands of hours of work for only hundreds of hours of pay. So what kinds of disciplines will be involved, and are there any special kinds of equipment, tools, software that would be required? One thing that comes immediately to mind is a project that I'm working on right now with some other folks at A&M, but also a computer scientist at Clemson. It was communicating hurricane information. It's taken us, it was a 3-year project, and it's taken us nearly 3 years just to get the program to do what we want it to do. We got it to work right within a year, but in the course of that year, we realized that some of the things that we wanted it to do didn't make sense anymore after we thought about it carefully. So think about this realistically, and my rule of thumb certainly on computer program development is whatever your number is that you think it's going to be, multiply it by 3. So specialized equipment, specialized computer software. So that's the economic cost and resources. The next one is what's the expected time to a realistic application? So it's not just purely applied research what we want are projects that NWS could, or its partners, could apply. So it could have something to do with the way that forecasts are developed or disseminated. And it may focus on, it may be purely within NWS. It could be the interface between NWS and state and local emergency management agencies, for example. Or it could be something involved with better ways of developing household preparedness, or it could be something that extends over the entire spectrum, evaluates, as a couple of people have suggested, a risk analysis or a systems analysis of the entire forecast warning system for tornadoes. So there may be some that are relatively more basic. There are some that are going to be more applied aspects to these, but the end point in any project should be an application that the Weather Service or its partners can use in tornado warnings. And that includes, at the applied end, might be a program evaluation. That is, you're not doing an analysis of how organizations respond or how individuals respond. There's a particular program or a technology that exists currently and that we're trying to move beyond the anecdotal level of evaluation to a much more comprehensive kind of evaluation. And then the last category would be implementation barriers. The most likely candidate there for consideration would be, especially for these applied projects, is going to be collaboration among federal agencies or between federal and state or federal and local levels, collaboration with non-governmental organizations. So that's a particularly salient barrier to implementation, but if you can think of something else, by all means, address that. Okay, so just to briefly go back over this again, economic costs, including other kinds of resources, expected time to a practical application, and then implementation barriers. So, yeah. Well, you've got 3 hours. Okay, does anybody have any questions about the charts? Yeah.
Mike, we'll take these slides right now and email them to all the participants. So by the time you get to the breakout room, you'll have the results of the second round in your inbox.
Okay, great. Okay. Yeah, Jay. Let 1,000 flowers bloom. If you, okay, actually that does remind me of one thing. Okay, first thing is that if you think that what you talked about in your disciplinary group generates 3 really important proposals or 3 really important projects, go ahead and do that. If you think that, and I'm hard-pressed to think that anybody is going to respond this way, but if you think that after discussing the issues in your disciplinary groups and thinking about it in the interdisciplinary groups, that none of what you talked about in your disciplinary group is worth proposing, that you can feel free to latch on to an idea that has come up during the past 2 days, or even a new idea that you can come up with. What I'd like to have you do is even that we're not going to explicitly rank all of the areas, but what I'd like you to do is to list what you think is the most important of the 3 first, the second most important second, and the third most important third. And then could you scroll down to, let's see, a couple of slides on that, on the guidance for the discussion group leaders. Well, I think I can describe it. Anyway, so there will be one slide that has number 1, 2, and 3. And so brief description, a paragraph or a little bit more that you could do as separate slides. But a description of the most important elements. What's the core description of the project that you're proposing? Then on the slide here it says evaluate that proposal with respect to the criteria that we just talked about. You can either list that separately so that proposal 1 you have let's see. So that you've got a 1 there for proposal 1. It's got a title or just a very, just a few words describing it. And then it's got economic cost and then a little narrative about that. Time to application, a little narrative about that. And implementation barriers, a little. Okay, so that's the numbers for the projects. Next slide. And so it's assess these research projects using the criteria. So that's the 3 criteria that we just talked about now. And so you can do that as 1, 2, and 3 on this slide, or you can incorporate that evaluation in, you can append that at the end of your project description. You could do it in the form of a matrix, but I'm not going to suggest that. Yes, they are. They're exactly the same disciplinary group. So it's same groups and same discussion leaders and same rooms. Okay, Ray. Dennis, did you hear that? Yeah, okay. Yes, some of these are projects that you could continue to throw money at for an indefinitely long period of time. And I think the answer is to your question to be as fair to you, but also to the administrators that are funding this conference. What we're trying to do is give them some sense of if they've got something that looks like it's going to have a significant impact, but it's going to cost, somebody puts a $50 million price tag on it, and somebody else, and there's another project that has a $5 million price tag on it, that if those costs are reasonably consistent and reasonably thoughtful, the way that most people would do with a proposal, that will give them some sense of what it is that they're likely to have for the commitment of that amount of money. Does that answer the question? Okay. Any other questions? Obviously, the implicit criterion there is it's going to be something that is going to have a meaningful impact on the kinds of criteria that we've been talking about for the past couple of days. Reduction of death and injuries, recognizing the problems that we have in actually measuring and attributing those to disasters, and also damage and disruption as well. And if there's something particular about that it's focused more on damage, reduction of damage and disruption rather than casualties, then that would be something to mention in the narrative. Okay, so with that, we can go to break, and then from there up to the discussion groups. We're a little bit ahead of time. So anyway, but not much. So you're targeted to continue on in the discussion groups until 5:30. Break when you feel that it's appropriate within your group. If you want to continue the discussions over dinner, but we'll see you all again in the morning in those discussion groups on the 4th floor. 414. Okay.